Number 10. The Diamond Lady. In 2022, the Mississippi River's water levels dropped to their lowest in at least a decade, revealing an array of fascinating discoveries that had previously been hidden beneath the water's surface. One of the most noteworthy relics to reappear was the Diamond Lady. She set sail from Bettendorf, Iowa, on her maiden voyage in 1991 as America's first legal riverboat casino since the 19th century. Wheel of Fortune hostess Vanna White famously christened the boat in front of 3,000 spectators before the first of the boat's 4 voyages that day. The Diamond Lady operated as a floating casino for a handful of years until it was replaced by a bigger vessel in 1994. In 2008, the disused riverboat was moved to a marina in Memphis, Tennessee. She sank during a harsh winter storm in 2021 and remained submerged until the 2022 drought, when she reappeared alongside several other boats that had met their fate in the mighty Mississippi. A lot of people were upset that the Diamond Lady's owners didn't take better care of her before she sank. While many were fascinated by the boat's mid-drought reemergence, the sight of the neglected vessel left others feeling bitter and betrayed, including former crew members who felt bitter and betrayed that the Diamond Lady was essentially left to rot and forgotten about. At number 9, Brook Hill Ferry. While searching for historic artifacts along the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge during a severe drought in 2022, local resident Patrick Ford spotted the remnants of an old wooden ship that had clearly been sitting along the riverbed for a very long time. Experts have long known about the wreck, according to state archaeologist Chip McGimsey, who told local station WBRZ that the deteriorating vessel is believed to be a 19th century ferry called the Brook Hill. Built in Indiana in 1896, the riverboat transported passengers back and forth between Baton Rouge and Port Allen until it sank during a storm in 1915. Before its recent reappearance, the only other time the Brook Hill had surfaced since its sinking was in 1992. It was so muddy that it was difficult to even tell what the object was. When the riverboat reemerged in 2022, it was a lot more exposed than the previous time, giving spectators a much better view of it. On the one hand, it was admittedly an exciting discovery, but the wreck's visibility was a worrying reminder of the river's record-low water levels, and several pieces of it were stolen by disrespectful visitors who wanted to selfishly take a piece of history that didn't belong to them. The theft came as a disappointment to the state's archaeology department, who had to open the site to the public after debating whether or not it was a good idea to do so. Even after being caught red-handed, one thief refused to return several pieces of the boat until he was contacted personally by Louisiana's Attorney General. Number 8. Resurfaced Pathway. La Garda is Italy's largest lake. Located in the country's northern region, it measures roughly 32 miles at its longest point and 10.4 miles at its widest. Unfortunately, like most other bodies of water throughout Italy, the lake has shrunk in recent years due to unprecedented drought conditions. In 2023, the dropping water levels revealed a walkway leading to the small island of San Biagio, which was previously only accessible by boat. As soon as the sand and stone pathway appeared, visitors began flocking to the island on foot and by bicycle. Local resident Alberto Pampuri expressed the irony of the freshly revealed walkway to the local, describing it as a beautiful sight while acknowledging the alarming climate conditions that caused it to reappear. And while the pathway brought much welcomed out-of-season business to San Biagio, people still hoped it would be soon back underwater. Number 7. Sant Roma. After experiencing record drought conditions in 2022, Spain was struck by an even worse dry spell the following year. While the country's officials scrambled to figure out a solution to the dwindling water supply, curious onlookers were drawn to the re-emerging ruins, shipwrecks, and other relics that were appearing above the water surface for the first time in decades. In the Catalonia region, the rapidly dropping waters of the Sau Reservoir revealed the ruins of an 11th century village called Sant Roma de Sau. The bell tower of the submerged settlement's 1,000-year-old church is typically the only visible remnant of the village, but as the reservoir's water supply plummeted to just 10%, the entire structure could be seen. Building foundations and an empty cemetery also re-emerged. Visitors enjoyed getting a first-hand glimpse at the previously submerged church, but it also served as a reminder of the severity of Spain's ongoing drought crisis and water shortage. All things considered, people were happy to visit the site, but they were also eager to see it resubmerged by replenished water levels. As of August 2023, Spain remains plagued by ongoing severe drought conditions, and the Catalonia region is in a state of emergency due to its perilously low water supply. Are you worried about drought? Let me know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Hunger stones. During an unusually hot and dry summer in 2018, poignant reminders of past droughts emerged along the Elbe River in northern Czech Republic in the form of etched boulders known as hunger stones. They were used to mark low water levels, and their presence shows that the people have been dealing with droughts for centuries. At least a dozen hunger stones appeared in the town of Děčín, with the oldest visible date reading 1616. In addition to the marking of the date and the water level, hunger stones sometimes contained other information. One etching mentions a poor harvest, a food shortage, rising prices, and hunger among the poor. Written in German, it also reads, "When you see me, weep." Researchers have identified traces of even older inscriptions linked to other historic droughts, including in 1417 and 1473. These troubling monuments also bear records of 10 droughts that occurred between 1707 and 1893. Hunger stones are found in various places throughout Europe, and even more of them are turning up as chronic drought conditions continue to worsen. Near the German town of Bleckede, there's a hunger stone that reads, "When this goes under, life will become more colorful again," reflecting the worsening desperation and despair that societies experienced in extreme weather. Number 5. The North Alabama. In 2022, the section of the Mississippi River that runs through Nebraska and South Dakota experienced its lowest water levels in years, revealing the wreck of a 19th century steamboat called the North Alabama. The 220-ton vessel was sailing from Sioux City, Iowa to Yellowstone County, Montana in 1870 when it got caught on a protruding log in the water near Goat Island. With a 2 by 8 foot gash torn into the hull, the boat began to take on water while crew members salvaged as much flour, whiskey, and other cargo as they could. A lot of it went down with the vessel, amounting to roughly $12,000 in lost goods, the equivalent of roughly $300,000 today. The captain died in the disaster, but it's believed that the rest of the crew survived. The wreck has reappeared several times since its sinking, including in 1904, 1906, during the 1930s, and in 2004. But the most recent appearance exposed much more of the vessel than usual. Around 400 steamboats sank in the Missouri River between 1819 and 1895 under similar circumstances. As the summers continue to get hotter and drier, most of these wrecks are likely to appear. Number 4. Luoyangdun Island. Like many other parts of the world, China has suffered persistent severe droughts in recent years. In August of 2022, the country experienced its worst heat wave and dry spell in decades, with temperatures in some regions exceeding 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius. Bodies of water shrank dramatically, including China's largest freshwater body known as Poyang Lake. While it's normal for the lake to experience a dry period on a fairly regular basis, water levels plummeted to levels unseen in decades. Amid the extreme weather, a historic stone island in the lake known as Luoyangdun Island became fully visible for the first time in 71 years. The stone landmass is typically partially submerged, but the extreme conditions exposed it right down to the base. As the ongoing drought continues, vast swaths of dry ground and cracked mud that were once underwater are becoming a common sight at Poyang Lake. The changes are creating a crisis not only at the human level, but for migratory birds who depend on the lake for food. In early 2023, the lake's water fell below 23 feet for the fourth time since the previous fall. On more than 80 separate occasions during that same time period, the water dropped below its previous record low. For more than a decade, authorities have been working to figure out a potential solution to the problem, but have yet to come up with a plan that will save the lake without negatively impacting the environment in other ways. Number 3. Rockport Ghost Town. During the early 1950s, nearly 30 families were forced to leave the village of Rockport, Utah, to make room for the construction of the Wanship Dam and Rockport Reservoir. Founded by European American settlers in 1860, the town was originally called Crandall. The settlement soon found itself caught in the crosshairs of the Black Hawk War, which was fought between the United States and various Native American tribes, including the Ute, Apache, and Navajo. Residents fled the town to get away from the violence. When they returned 6 years later in 1867, they built a wall around the settlement and renamed it Rockport. After learning about the planned construction of the Wanship Dam, the town's remaining 200 residents relocated and preserved several of Rockport's buildings, including the local schoolhouse. In 2021, the Rockport Reservoir was reduced to a quarter of its total capacity, revealing the old foundations and streets of the former town for the first time in 64 years. Little is left of the town besides crumbling foundations, but it was enough to tell that man-made structures once stood at the site. The ruins weren't visible for very long. Within a year of the town's exposure, the Rockport Dam had replenished to 90% capacity thanks to the ample snowpack runoff it saw in 2022. Number 2. Zibello. At 405 miles long, the Po River is Italy's longest river, connecting the Alps and the Adriatic Sea. As a years-long drought continued into 2022, a World War II-era barge called the Zibello, which normally sits mostly or entirely underwater, became fully visible. The 164-foot-long vessel was used for transporting wood and other supplies up and down the river. It sank during an Allied bombardment of the town of Gualtieri in 1943. In recent years, the Zibello's bow has become increasingly visible, but the dramatic drop in the river's water level in early 2022 was especially noticeable. By the end of winter, the entire vessel was visible. The barge towered over its surroundings for over 3 months as Italy went 100 days with no rainfall. At the same time, the country was expecting a 70% decrease in snowfall. The lack of rain and the unusually high temperatures caused water levels to fall even faster than they would during a conventional drought, causing people to fear what the future could bring as climate change accelerates. Some have even worried that the Po River could dry up, depriving the country of its most important waterway. It would be a disaster to say the least, and the prospect of a crisis continues to loom as leaders and experts struggle to find solutions to the devastating droughts in Italy and elsewhere throughout Europe. In early 2023, news sources reported that the winter season had brought little, if any, relief to Italy's lakes and rivers, where ample flowing water is becoming an increasingly rare sight. And at number 1, the Temple of Santiago de Cuachella. During the construction of the Malpaso Dam in Mexico's Chiapas state in 1966, residents of the village of Cuachella were given no choice but to resettle elsewhere. The abandoned settlement was submerged by the newly built reservoir, with the very top of a historic 16th century Catholic church poking out of the water as the only visible reminder of the former village. For years, the church served as a tourist destination. Visitors traveled to the site by boat to admire what they could see of it. In 2023, high temperatures and a lack of rain caused the reservoir's water level to drop dramatically, revealing the church in its entirety for the first time since the dam was built. Those who wanted to see parts of the structure that are normally underwater took advantage of the opportunity. Tourists flocked to the site, where they were able to pull right up to the gates with their cars and motorcycles. The church was built by the Dominican Order of Preachers at a time when the region was under Spanish colonial control. Some of the earliest European missionaries to visit the Americas would have passed through the area, which remained continuously inhabited for centuries to come until the creation of the Malpaso Dam.
The Night Stalkers. The United States Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment is an elite group with many harrowing accomplishments under its belt. Nicknamed the Night Stalkers, these accolades include transporting the Navy SEALs who killed Osama bin Laden in 2011, as well as their participation in the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, which inspired the movie Black Hawk Down. The Night Stalkers also participated in a lesser-known mission called Operation Mount Hope 3, which took place at the end of an equally little-known conflict called the Toyota War. So, exactly what is it that makes the Night Stalkers so great at what they do? Established in 1981, this Special Operations Force consists of some of the US Army's best aviators, crew chiefs, and support soldiers. Those who are skilled enough to be assigned to the 160th endure intensive training to prepare them for the high-stakes missions that they can expect to encounter throughout the remainder of their military career. During their training, members focus on advancing their skills in 5 key areas of combat: first responder, land navigation, combatives, weapons, and teamwork. Each soldier who becomes a full-fledged Night Stalker can expect to fire thousands of rounds during their training alone, using weapons including AK-47 style rifles, Beretta M9 pistols, M4/M4A1 carbines, and Sig Sauer M17/M18 pistols. Recruits who fail their initial training are given the option to retake it, but there's never any guarantee of making it into the 160th. Each round of initial training lasts 5 weeks, while the training to become an officer lasts for anywhere from 20 to 28 weeks. A Night Stalker pilot is expected to undergo a specific round of qualifications testing in order to become fully mission qualified, or FMQ. Pilots who receive FMQ status typically remain in that rank for 3 to 5 years before they're eligible to try out for flight lead qualification. Simply put, in order to become a Night Stalker, a soldier needs to really know their stuff. And it isn't just about passing the initial tests, but about keeping up with the requirements over time and proving that you've still got it. This is why the 160th was specifically chosen for Operation Mount Hope 3, which came several months after the end of a conflict known as the Toyota War. The Toyota War. Over an 8-month period starting in late 1986, a conflict known as the Toyota War was fought in northern Chad and along the Chad-Libya border. It came following Libya's occupation of a region in northern Chad known as the Alzu Strip in 1983 and was named for the Toyota pickup trucks the Chadian forces used in their fight against the Libyans. Throughout the war, the Chadians received immense support from the United States and France, while Libya was backed by Soviet-made military equipment. Much of this equipment was captured by the Chadians and/or abandoned by the Libyans during the conflict. It was a Soviet-made Mi-24 helicopter in particular that inspired the top-secret US mission, codenamed Operation Mount Hope 3. The Toyota War ended with a major victory for the Chadians, who only suffered 1,000 losses. Meanwhile, the vastly outnumbered Libyans suffered a crushing defeat, which included the loss of at least 1/10 of their army, or around 7,500 men and $1.5 billion worth of military equipment. The end of the war marked the end of a series of clashes between Chad and Libya, but the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States remained alive and well, and would soon give rise to the American military's clandestine plan to acquire a Soviet helicopter under the cover of night. The Mi-25 Hind and the Chadian-Libyan conflict. Known by the NATO reporting name Hind, the Mi-25 is one of the designated export versions of the Soviet-built Mi-24 military helicopter. By definition, it's a helicopter gunship, attack helicopter, and low-capacity troop transport vehicle. Dubbed the Flying Tank by Soviet pilots, development on the Mi-24 began during the early 1960s. A mock-up of what would eventually become the Mi-24 was unveiled in 1966. Its designer, aerospace engineer Mikhail Mil, developed it with a few key points in mind. He had noticed a trend toward ever-increasing battlefield mobility, which translated in his mind to the need for flying infantry fighting vehicles that were capable of providing both battlefield support and for infantry transport missions. Mil died in 1970, but work on the aircraft continued. The final product, aka the Mi-24, also known by its export designations Mi-25 and Mi-35, was introduced in 1972. It had no direct Western counterpart. In other words, there was no Western version of the Mi-24, and nothing even close to it. During the later stages of the Cold War, it came to play an imperative role as a Soviet workhorse and was eventually adopted by other countries' militaries. The Mi-25 Hind eventually came to play a significant role in the Chadian-Libyan conflict, which was actually a series of conflicts that began long before the Toyota War back in 1978. The Chadian-Libyan conflict began with Libya's repeated interventions in the Chadian civil war that was ongoing at the time. 2 years into the conflict, Libyan forces began using both the Mi-24 and Mi-25 variants. The choppers made their first appearances during the Battle of N'Djamena in October 1980. 7 years later, during the Toyota War, the US and French-backed Chadian armed forces of the north recaptured the military stronghold of the Wadi Daum in northern Chad, bringing the decades-long succession of conflicts between Chad and Libya to an unceremonious end. In addition to its use during the Chadian-Libyan conflict, the Mi-24 saw combat in 1977 during the Ogaden War, when it was used by pro-Soviet Ethiopian forces against Somalia. The aircraft and its export variant were also used during the Soviet War in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, the Nicaraguan Civil War, which also lasted from 1980 to 1988, and the Sri Lankan Civil War, which lasted from 1979 to 2009. Before we continue, we just wanted to say thanks for watching. We appreciate our viewers. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Why steal an Mi-25? During the late 1980s, the Cold War was nearing its end, but it wasn't over, and the decades-old rivalry between the USSR and the United States was as alive and well as ever. Much like modern-day Russia, the Soviets were notoriously secretive about their technological developments, or as one might say, they kept their cards close to their chest. This was especially true when it came to the Soviet Union's military advancements. In order to learn anything about these well-kept secrets, Western countries were left with few other choices than to hijack an example of the sought-after machinery themselves. During the Vietnam War and other 20th century conflicts, the United States acquired plenty of examples of Soviet small arms. During the 1980s, US forces even managed to get their hands on a T-72 main battle tank, MBT. But for the most part, the Americans had failed to obtain large pieces of Soviet-designed military equipment, including any helicopters, despite their numerous failed efforts. When they realized that the Libyans had left behind an operational Mi-25 after the Toyota War, they saw the opportunity to steal it. By doing so, the Americans would obtain an unprecedented look at a large piece of Soviet machinery that, until then, had been inaccessible. Preparing for Operation Mount Hope 3. In what went down in history as one of the most brazen recent military heists, more than 60 Night Stalkers went up against sandstorms and faced the threat of opposing Libyan forces in order to steal a Mi-25 Soviet-built attack helicopter that the Libyans left behind during the Toyota War. By getting their hands on Soviet technology and reverse engineering it, the Americans planned to learn more about it. Also known as the Hind Heist, the plan was codenamed Operation Mount Hope 3. In fact, the US had long hoped to acquire an Mi-25 Hind, and now they finally had their chance. A previous attempt to obtain one of the choppers had failed after having to cut up the vehicle for transport, which rendered it non-airworthy. In other words, it couldn't fly, so a do-over was necessary, and this time the helicopter would have to be transported by some other means, all in one piece. Prior to moving forward with the new plan, US, French, and Chadian officials engaged in lengthy three-way negotiations. Chad eventually gave the Americans the go-ahead to take the Mi-25 from the military installation at Wadi Daum. In return, the US government handed over $2 million and a supply of missiles. To avoid a repeat of past problems, the plan involved airlifting the Mi-25. And to prevent any mistakes that could jeopardize the mission, the military called on the Night Stalkers to carry out the operation. Training for Operation Mount Hope 3 began in April of 1988, a little over 6 months after the end of the Toyota War. To best prepare for the mission, the Night Stalkers disassembled several MH-45 Chinook helicopters and flew them to White Sands, New Mexico, inside a transport aircraft to simulate the initial deployment to Chad. They then performed nighttime flights with the Chinooks, while one of the choppers carried a load of water that was meant to mimic the weight of a Hind helicopter. The flight to acquire the Soviet aircraft would be a complicated route, which would require several landings for refueling. The Night Stalkers factored this into their practice runs. Almost go time. On May 21, 1988, the Night Stalkers received their official order to commence with Operation Mount Hope 3. 10 days later, an advance party arrived in Chad's capital city, N'Djamena. During the second week of June, 2 partially disassembled M47 Chinooks and more than 60 personnel were delivered to N'Djamena courtesy of a C-5 Galaxy military aircraft. While the official plan called for just 1 helicopter, an extra was brought along in case anything went wrong. The Galaxy landed at N'Djamena International Airport at dusk. Military personnel immediately got to work unloading and reassembling the Chinooks. Anything that added unnecessary weight to the choppers was removed, while additional fuel tanks were installed in the cargo areas, enabling each helicopter to carry an extra 600 gallons of fuel. By then, the Libyans had already gone to great lengths to destroy a lot of the military equipment they'd left behind. They did so largely at the Soviet Union's urging, specifically to prevent any recovery efforts that the Americans might undertake. But in the process, they apparently forgot to destroy the 1 Mi-25 Hind helicopter that the US eventually narrowed its sights on. Go time. At midnight sharp, on June 11th, the Chinooks began the 550-mile flight to Wadi Daum. Operation Mount Hope 3 had officially begun. At the time, there were still some Libyan forces in the area, making speed and secrecy crucial to the mission. The Night Stalkers were especially worried that if any Libyan forces caught on to their attempt to retrieve a helicopter, they might bomb any desirable equipment that remained. By the time the actual recovery was underway, an advance team had already traveled covertly to Wadi Daum. They secured the airfield and prepared the Hind helicopter for transport. In doing so, they discovered that the chopper was almost airworthy. In other words, it was almost in good enough condition to fly it rather than airlift it, but not quite. One of its engines had been struck by a bullet, and it was considered too risky to try flying it. Once they arrived on site, both Chinook's additional fuel tanks were removed because they added too much weight for the choppers to lift the Hind. Instead, the Night Stalkers loaded the fuel tanks and the Hind's rotor blades onto a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft and flew them out from the site. With the Hind slung beneath one of the Chinooks, both MH-47 helicopters took off for N'Djamena. Along the way, they stopped twice to refuel from C-130s that the US Air Force had established ahead of time as temporary refueling points. At the second refueling stop, the Americans received backup assistance from a unit of the French Foreign Legion. The French also helped by providing air cover when and where it was needed. Perfect timing. The Chinooks narrowly avoided getting directly caught in a sandstorm as they touched back down at N'Djamena with the Mi-25 Hind in tow. After waiting for the sandstorm to pass, the Americans loaded the Hind onto a C-5 Galaxy transport plane. The 2 MH-47s were partially disassembled and were also loaded onto a second C-5 for transport back to the United States. From there, the 2 C-5s proceeded to Fort Rucker, Alabama, stopping in Ascension Island and Antigua to refuel along the way. The Mi-25 Hind arrived at Fort Rucker on June 16th, 5 days after Operation Mount Hope 3 officially began. In order to properly evaluate the aircraft, it was restored to flying condition. After that, the chopper was taken to the Threat Systems Management Office, where its capabilities were demonstrated to various military units. The Mi-25 was also used in training exercises as a representation of an enemy vehicle. By analyzing the stolen Hind, the military learned that it had truly earned its reputation as a flying gunship. It was heavily armed with a variety of powerful guns, a fixed twin-barrel autocannon, and external stores for carrying multiple types of weapons, including bombs, anti-tank guided missiles, rocket pods, and additional machine gun pods. Since its capture and its time spent as a learning tool, the highly coveted Soviet chopper has found yet a new purpose. In 2012, it was given to the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama, where it remains on public display to this day. By donating the aircraft, the military enabled it to narrowly avoid its plans to scrap the vehicle.
There are some epic David versus Goliath battles in history, and today we'll explore the bravery of Commander Ernest E. Evans. He was a World War II hero that boldly led a small fleet of U.S. ships against a massive Japanese fleet that included one of the most terrifying vessels in history. Ernest Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1908 and was a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. During his formative years, he lived with his mother and sister. Evans faced prejudices growing up, but he worked hard and graduated from high school. After that, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. His initial plan was to join the Marine Corps, but he injured his knee in high school. So Evans was appointed to join the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He then graduated as an ensign in 1931, and while he was in the Navy, he was nicknamed Chief. Before World War II, Evans was assigned to various ships. When the U.S. entered the war, he was serving on the USS Alden, and by 1944, he was commander of the USS Johnston. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer that was built in Seattle in 1942. Military historians have noted that the Johnston and similar Fletcher-type destroyers were vital pieces to the U.S. Navy fleet that served during World War II. They were known for being quick and were able to take a great deal of damage from other ships during battle. The ship was named after John Vincent Johnston, a commander of a gunboat during the Civil War. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, who served for Evans, apparently had this to say about him. "I can see him now. Short, barrel-chested, standing on the bridge with his hands on his hips." He then said that Evans would give out a running fire of orders in a bull-like voice. It's said that during the commissioning of the Johnston, Evans stated that the vessel was going to be a fighting ship and that he intended to go into harm's way. He then gave the appointed crew the option of getting off the ship if they didn't want to go along with his sometimes risky orders. War in the Pacific. In January and February of 1944, the Johnston was involved in the bombardment of the Japanese at the Marshall Islands and provided support for U.S. troops. And there was similar success in July of that same year when the Johnston was sent to the Solomon Islands. Evans' bravery shined bright on May 16, 1944, when his ship encountered a Japanese submarine. He managed to successfully maneuver the Johnston and dropped depth charges against the enemy sub. The attack resulted in the destruction of the submarine, but all that was visible to the crew of the Johnston was an oil slick. The Johnston's crew also reported hearing a heavy underwater ripple explosion, coupled with the appearance of debris along the surface of the water. This earned Evans the Bronze Star, an award for heroic achievement, and the award's citation praised him for quickly regaining contact with the submarine. The Johnston would go on to join the USS Pennsylvania in July 1944 to bombard Japanese defenses in Guam. And by the end of that month, the Johnston had fired some 4,000 shells. Reclaiming the Philippines. 5 months after his success against a Japanese submarine, Evans and the Johnston had a new mission in the Pacific. They were part of an operation to reclaim the Philippines from Japanese control. The United States had gained control of the Philippines in 1898, following the Spanish-American War. And it was December 1941 when the Japanese launched an assault on the Philippines, which surprised the Filipinos and the American military stationed on the island. By 1944, the U.S. and Great Britain were successful in their island-hopping campaign in the Pacific to weaken the grip Japan had on the Pacific. And the Philippines was key in this campaign. If the Allied forces could claim the island, then they could cut off the Japanese supply lines. The Philippines would be an excellent location for Allied forces to launch missions against Japanese-controlled islands in the area. The waterlogged country was also a point where the Allies could begin their invasion of the island of Formosa, later known as Taiwan. The powers that be weren't certain if the Philippines should be taken by force or if the plans for an invasion should be shelved. It was General Douglas MacArthur who decided on an invasion. MacArthur had fought valiantly against the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942 and vowed that he'd return. It was September 1944 when attacks against the Japanese in the Philippines were launched. Bombing missions by the Allies were also launched, and October 1944 saw fighting on Leyte, an island that's part of the Philippines. And on October 20th, to be exact, an amphibious assault was launched by the Allies on Leyte. The Japanese devised a masterful plan known as Shogo, which was also referred to as Operation Victory. Their strategy aimed to divert the U.S. ships north of the island of Leyte while deploying a powerful fleet of Japanese ships to disrupt the ongoing assault on the island within the Leyte Gulf. Shogo commenced on a promising note as the Japanese successfully diverted the U.S. fleet to the north, creating an opportunity for their battle-hardened ships to advance into the Leyte Gulf and potentially alter the course of the conflict. In that Japanese fleet were 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. And the star of that fleet was the feared Yamato. At 863 feet, 263 meters, the Yamato was one of the biggest battleships in naval history. It was armed with massive guns to intimidate the enemy, and the anti-aircraft guns on the ship were incredibly nasty. When fired, a timed fuse in the shell would be triggered. The shell would then explode in the airspace, filling it with burning steel and shrapnel. Additionally, the Yamato was heavily armored. Those that sailed on the Yamato claimed that the ship didn't have any pitch or roll due to its armor. Sailors felt as if they were standing on firm ground while at sea on the vessel. Also, the ship could move at 27 knots, or roughly 31 miles per hour, 50 kilometers per hour. In 1942, the Yamato became the flagship for the combined fleet under the command of Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. But on Christmas Day in 1943, the submarine USS Skate, which was patrolling the waters off Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, successfully fired a torpedo at the Yamato and did some damage. It was down but not out. So, after repairs, the Yamato went into action in the Philippines under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita. It would be Kurita that would lead the Japanese ships in what would be the Battle off Samar. And all that was standing in the way of this intimidating Japanese fleet was a ragtag group of U.S. ships, including the Johnston under the command of Ernest Evans. Do you think you have what it takes to command a fleet of battleships? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Battle off Samar. It was the morning of October 25, 1944, near Samar, when a Taffy 3, a U.S. Navy escort carrier group, noticed anti-aircraft fire in the distance. The Japanese had successfully diverted a main U.S. fleet from the region. However, Taffy 3 wasn't the kind of group to engage with a massive Japanese fleet. Aircraft had encountered the Yamato and their massive armada in the Leyte Gulf near the island of Samar, the third largest in the Philippines. Enemy presence was news to Taffy 3 because they were under the impression that the area was clear of enemy ships. It's rumored that some commanders dismissed the initial reports as mistakes made by U.S. pilots patrolling the region. They believed the pilots mistook U.S. ships as enemy ships. Taffy 3 consisted of the Johnston, 6 jeep carriers, a few destroyers, and a few destroyer escorts. Ernest Evans knew he was outmatched. He understood that the Japanese fleet could easily bombard the soldiers that had made it to Leyte. Evans knew that he had to confront the enemy. He couldn't run away from this battle. If the Japanese were to advance past the Taffy 3, then the U.S. troops that had landed on the Philippines would be in danger of massive bombardments. And this encounter would be known as the Battle off Samar. The U.S. fleet didn't have the firepower or armor for a full-on battle. However, Evans had an advantage with technology. Fire control systems on ships like the Johnston allowed them to fire with greater accuracy than their enemy. So Evans decided to send the Johnston toward the Japanese in a zigzag pattern. It's reported that he said the following to his crew: "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected." Evans knew if he was close enough, he could launch 2 torpedoes. But he also had another plan. He created a smoke screen using the Johnston. It would make it difficult for guns on Japanese ships to be effective. Evans then ordered torpedoes to be fired, and they damaged an enemy cruiser. He also ordered his guns to be fired at the enemy. He gave them everything he had, knowing the Japanese were far more powerful. The Johnston's gunnery officer later recalled, "We felt like little David without a slingshot." Evans ordered the Johnston to move back so they could hide in the smokescreen. But the Japanese fleet fired upon the ship, causing immediate damage. As a result, one of the vessel's 2 engines was lost. So, Evans pulled his ship back into a squall, or violent windstorm, to regroup. They had 15 minutes before the enemy would attack again, and the squall was like a smokescreen because the storm would make enemy gunfire ineffective. For 3 hours, Evans led the Johnston in a valiant fight against the Japanese. Damage to the Johnston was extensive, but Evans still ordered the ship to fight. The Johnston had lost its secondary steering mechanism, as well as its communication lines to engineering and the bridge. The only way he was able to communicate was through an open hatch where he screamed orders. The situation was frantic, but Evans wasn't shaken in the slightest. It's said that Evans had his shirt blown off during the battle, and he lost 2 fingers in the process. The crew fought with bravery and ferocity. But the repeated hits from the Japanese resulted in the loss of power to all 3 of the ship's 5-inch, 13-centimeter guns, and rendered the Johnston's gyro compass completely useless. The USS Howell was also involved in this battle. Howell was a destroyer, and it fired torpedoes at the Japanese fleet as well. This tactic did cause confusion among the enemy as their ships frantically maneuvered from the torpedoes, which halted their attack. However, when the Japanese regrouped, they opened fire on the Howell, and unfortunately, it too took heavy damage during the battle while on a zigzag course. The Japanese continued their attack by firing torpedoes toward the US fleet. The ships fought in such a manner that Admiral Takeo Kurita, the commander of the Japanese fleet, was convinced he was up against a superior naval force. During the battle, the Johnston suffered extensive damage, leaving Evans with no choice but to abandon ship. The Johnston then rolled over, and as the vessel sank into the ocean, the captain of a nearby Japanese destroyer saluted the crew of the Johnston. Of the 327 men on board, an estimated 186 died, including Evans. 3 other U.S. ships sank that day. But somehow, the bravery of Taffy 3 stopped the advancement of the massive Japanese fleet. In his book, The History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, historian Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison said that no other engagement in the entire history of the U.S. has the country's Navy shown more guts, gallantry, and gumption than in the Battle off Samar. Sam Evans, head of the Naval History and Heritage Command, discussed the Battle off Samar and the legacy of Ernest Evans with an Oklahoma newspaper. He said, "This key battle in the Pacific War was almost a disaster for the United States." And he goes on to say that if it hadn't been for the actions of Evans, the battle would have gone much worse. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. He was also the first person of Native American ancestry to earn this honor for the U.S. Navy. His citation basically says that despite facing heavy damage from the intense enemy barrage, he fearlessly and without hesitation joined fellow members of his group in providing fire support during subsequent torpedo attacks against the Japanese forces. Evans was praised for outstanding and outmaneuvering the enemy as he consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile Japanese fleet and U.S. carriers, despite the crippling loss of engine power. The USS Evans was named in his honor and was a destroyer escort. The vessel was in service for the U.S. Navy from 1955 until it was scrapped in 1968. The Yamato, on the other hand, was in service until it was sunk in April of 1945 during a fierce battle. The wreckage of the USS Johnston was discovered in 2019. It's considered to be one of the deepest shipwrecks at 21,180 feet. 6,460 meters. A submersible research vessel called the Petrel was sent down by an exploration team to examine the wreckage. They were able to identify the ship by its assigned number, which apparently is still visible. The pilot of the submersible explained to the BBC that the wreck is so deep that oxygen is scarce, and because of this, the ship has remained remarkably preserved. despite its encounters with the turbulent waters of an intense battle. Wreaths were placed in the ocean by the exploration team to honor those who lost their lives on the Johnston. Ernest Evans and his crew were part of a battle that's been overshadowed in World War II history. The odds were against them, but they put everything on the line for freedom. And the sacrifices made by our military and these men will never be forgotten. Do you have any other amazing military leaders you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.